the blueprint of erasure before the Mongol Empire had banners, capitals, or laws carved into memory. It had an idea so cold and methodical that history later struggled to name it, let alone describe it honestly. The deliberate erasure of entire peoples by design, not chaos, and the use of bloodlines as tools of statecraft. Temujin, the man the world would come to call Genghis Khan, did not rise from legend or destiny alone. He rose from hunger, betrayal, and a childhood shaped by the sudden poisoning of his father and the abandonment of his family on the unforgiving steppe. And those early wounds taught him a lesson he never forgot, that survival demanded control, and control demanded permanence. By the early 13th century, when Temujin turned his armies against the Tatars, the tribe he believed responsible for his father's death, his vengeance, took a form that stunned even seasoned steppe warriors, because it was precise rather than furious, measured rather than wild. After defeating them in 1202, he issued an order that sounded simple but carried irreversible consequences. Every male taller than the iron pin of a cartwheel axle was to be executed on the spot, a crude measurement that transformed life and death into a mechanical decision, stripping mercy from the act entirely. Boys were dragged forward, held beside wagons, and judged in seconds. Their futures ended not for what they had done, but for what they might one day become. The killings were swift and total, ensuring that no male line would survive to remember, avenge, or reclaim power, but what followed revealed the deeper design behind the slaughter. The women were spared, not out of compassion, but because they served a different purpose, one that reached far beyond the battlefield, as they were divided among this. Conquerors, absorbed into households, marriages, and camps, where their identities were slowly dissolved. Temujin himself selected women of high status and beauty, binding them directly to his inner circle, not as an act of indulgence, but as strategy, because by absorbing the women and erasing the men, an entire people could vanish within a single generation, their name remembered only in whispered curses. This was the moment when conquest became something more than victory, when war turned into a system that reshaped societies from the inside, using kinship and reproduction as instruments of domination. And once the method proved effective, it did not remain an exception. It became a template. Across the steppe, defeated clans would soon learn that resistance meant annihilation, while submission meant absorption, a quiet death of culture rather than body. And the Mongol war machine rolled forward, powered not only by horses and arrows, but by a terrifying certainty that defeat meant the end of your future itself. Yet even this was only the foundation, because once Temujin mastered the destruction of enemies through bloodlines, he turned his attention inward, toward controlling his own people with laws that reached into the most private corners of life. And in the shadows of that emerging code, a far darker structure was taking shape, one that would bind desire, loyalty, and fear into a single, unbreakable rule. Women as empire currency. After the first experiments proved successful, conquest under Genghis Khan no longer ended when the fighting stopped, because the battlefield was only the opening act in a much longer process of control. Victory was followed by sorting, recording, and redistribution, and at the center of this system stood women, treated not as individuals, but as vessels through which power, loyalty, and the future itself could be reshaped. In the Mongol world, marriage was never simply personal, and after a tribe's defeat, it became a political operation as deliberate as any military maneuver, guided by custom, hierarchy, and the will of the Khan. Women of high lineage were identified first, their family ties carefully noted, because blood carried influence, memory, and legitimacy, and by redirecting that blood into Mongol hands, entire histories could be rewritten without burning a single book. Some women were taken directly into the households of commanders, others assigned as wives or concubines to sons, and trusted generals, forming invisible chains of obligation that bound new families to the conqueror's throne. What looked from the outside like indulgence or cruelty was, from within the system, an engine of governance, because every child born from these unions weakened the identity of the defeated and strengthened the reach of the empire. The Mongols did not simply rule territory. They rewired inheritance, ensuring that future leaders would carry Mongol blood even if their mothers came from conquered lands, turning former enemies into ancestors of imperial heirs. This practice reached far beyond revenge, because it offered a terrifying choice to the defeated: extinction or absorption, death or disappearance, and many chose the latter, hoping survival might preserve something of their past, even as it slowly slipped away. Yet this system also carried a deep tension, because women who entered the Mongol court did not vanish into silence, and some would come to wield power in ways that history struggled to explain or accept. Removed from their original clans, but embedded within the ruling family, they learned the language, customs, and politics of their captors, navigating a court where survival demanded intelligence, patience, and absolute awareness of shifting loyalties. Over time, some became advisors, regents, and guardians of succession, shaping policy from behind veils and walls, while chroniclers focused their attention on the men who rode at the front of armies. To the Mongols, this outcome was not a flaw in the system, but proof of its strength, because loyalty forged through blood was stronger than loyalty demanded by fear alone. And even grief could be transformed into service if it was tied to the survival of one's children. Yet beneath this cold logic lay a deeper contradiction, because a system built on control of reproduction required constant enforcement, constant vigilance, and strict rules governing desire, ownership, and obedience, and without law, the entire structure risked collapsing into chaos. As the empire expanded and its population exploded with absorbed peoples, Genghis Khan understood that conquest alone could not maintain order, and so he prepared to impose a code that would reach further than swords. Ever could a law that would govern bodies as tightly as it governed armies, and once that law was declared, no one within the empire would remain untouched. The law that controlled the body, as the Mongol Empire stretched across deserts, forests, and cities it barely understood, Genghis Khan recognized a danger greater than any enemy army: disorder from within. Conquest had gathered countless tribes, cultures, and customs under one banner, and without a unifying force stronger than tradition, the empire could fracture under its own weight. The answer was not mercy or trust, but law, a harsh and penetrating code known later as the Yasa, a set of rules spoken aloud, memorized, and enforced with absolute brutality. Unlike laws carved into stone, the Yasa lived in fear, because it governed not only crimes and punishments, but behavior, desire, and the most intimate parts of daily life, reaching places no ruler before had dared to control so completely. Sexual conduct was not private under this system. It was a matter of state, because reproduction meant succession, loyalty, and stability, and uncontrolled desire threatened the careful structure built through conquest and marriage. Adultery was punishable by death, not as a moral failing, but as a political threat, since uncertainty over lineage could unravel alliances forged through blood. Women taken into Mongol households were protected property of the Khan and his commanders, and violating those boundaries was treated as treason rather than passion. Even consent carried little meaning when obedience was the highest virtue, because survival depended on strict compliance, not individual will. The Yasa also dictated how women were distributed after conquest, who could take them, and under what conditions, transforming human relationships into regulated transactions overseen by authority. For Mongol soldiers, restraint was enforced through terror, because unapproved violence or seizure disrupted order, and the punishment for stepping outside the system was often execution, no matter one's rank. This created a strange paradox, where cruelty was allowed only when sanctioned, and mercy was irrelevant if it interfered with control. The law extended beyond women, shaping how families were formed, how children were raised, and how loyalty was inherited, binding personal survival to obedience so tightly that rebellion became almost unthinkable. Those who lived under the Yasa understood that their bodies were no longer fully their own. They belonged to the empire, measured by usefulness and governed by rules that offered no appeal. Chroniclers rarely wrote these details, openly often disguising them as discipline or order, because admitting the extent of control challenged the image of heroic conquest. Yet fragments survived in Persian records, foreign envoys' notes, and the uneasy silence surrounding Mongol domestic life. To outsiders, the empire appeared unstoppable, but within its camps and courts, fear was constant, maintained not only by execution grounds, but by the knowledge that even private acts could bring public death. This was how Genghis Khan ensured unity across unimaginable distances, not by shared belief, but by shared vulnerability, because when everyone lived under the same threat, loyalty followed naturally. Still, the Yasa did more than preserve power. It quietly elevated certain women into positions of influence, because enforcing lineage and succession required guardians, mothers, and regents, and from within this rigid system, unexpected figures would soon rise, shaping the empire's future from behind the law that had once imprisoned them. Mothers of future conquerors within the rigid order of the Mongol Empire, where law governed bodies and fear preserved. Unity, a quiet transformation, was taking place that few outsiders noticed, and even fewer historians later emphasized. The rise of women who would become the unseen architects of imperial power. These women entered the Mongol world as captives' brides or political offerings, stripped of their former identities, yet once inside the ruling households. They occupied a position unlike any other because the empire's obsession with bloodlines placed mothers at the center of its future. In a system where succession determined stability, the woman who bore a son did more than give birth. She became the guardian of legitimacy, the anchor of continuity in a violent and uncertain world. Mongol custom granted mothers significant authority over their children's upbringing, education, and alliances, and as sons grew into generals and rulers, the influence of their mothers expanded quietly behind the scenes. Some of these women learned to navigate court politics with remarkable precision, balancing rival factions, protecting heirs, and advising husbands or sons who trusted their judgment more than that of war-hardened commanders. Their power did not come from armies or titles, but from proximity, patience, and the unbreakable bond between mother and child, a bond the empire itself depended upon. One marriage could redirect the future of entire regions, and one mother could shape the character of a ruler who would command millions, making these women central to the empire's long-term survival. Yet their position was never secure, because the same laws that elevated them could also destroy them, and a single accusation, failure, or shift in favor could lead to exile or death. This constant danger forced them to master restraint, secrecy, and strategic silence, turning the Mongol court into a place where words were weighed as carefully as weapons. Chroniclers often reduced these women to footnotes or wives' names, but their actions echoed across continents, influencing decisions that determined whether cities were spared or erased. Through regencies and advisory roles, some effectively ruled in times of transition, maintaining order while male heirs were too young or absent on campaign, proving that the empire's strength did not rest solely on the battlefield. To the Mongols, this outcome was not accidental. It was a consequence of a system designed to fuse conquest with family, ensuring that power flowed through controlled lineage rather than chance. Yet this arrangement carried a haunting irony, because women who had once symbolized the defeat of their people became the mothers of new empires, their personal histories buried beneath the demands of survival and authority. As generations passed, the origins of these women faded from memory, replaced by imperial narratives of destiny and right. But beneath those stories lay lives shaped by loss, adaptation, and relentless pressure. And as these mothers shaped the next wave of conquerors, historians would later struggle with a troubling question. If the empire owed so much to women it had once broken and absorbed, what truths had been deliberately left out of the official record, And why had history chosen silence over acknowledgement? Why history looked away when the Mongol Empire finally fractured and its thunder faded into legend, the task of remembering. It fell to historians, chroniclers, and court writers who faced a dangerous problem: how to record an empire built on terror without condemning the very forces that reshaped the world. Many chose silence, others chose admiration, and almost all sought the darkest elements, especially those involving women, reproduction, and private power, because these truths challenged the heroic image of conquest that later rulers wanted to inherit. Victors controlled the narrative, and the Mongols, like empires before and after them, understood that memory itself was a weapon. Official histories emphasized cavalry tactics, administrative genius, and religious tolerance, presenting Genghis Khan as a lawgiver and unifier, while the human cost of his systems was pushed to the margins or erased entirely. Sexual politics were particularly dangerous to describe openly, because acknowledging them exposed conquest, not as destiny or bravery, but as calculated domination of bodies and bloodlines, a reality that made empire look less glorious and more mechanical. Persian chroniclers who served under Mongol rule often wrote with caution, embedding hints of brutality between lines of praise, aware that direct criticism could mean death, while Chinese and Islamic scholars filtered their accounts through moral frameworks that condemned excess but avoided confrontation. European envoys, shocked by what they witnessed, recorded fragments in letters and travel accounts, yet even these were shaped by distance, fear, and misunderstanding, leaving later readers with incomplete and distorted images, making the Mongols an uncomfortable reflection rather than a distant exception. It was easier to portray them as uniquely brutal outsiders than to examine how similar methods had appeared wherever power sought permanence. Archaeology and comparative studies would later challenge this silence, revealing burial patterns, population collapses, and sudden shifts in lineage that matched the written hints of erasure and absorption. Yet even then, many modern retellings avoided the personal dimension, preferring statistics over stories. To speak of numbers is safer than to speak of women taken, identities erased, and lives redirected under threat of death. History, after all, often protects itself by abstraction. Yet the gaps remain visible to those who look closely in the sudden disappearance of tribal names, in genealogies that leap without explanation, and in the quiet prominence of mothers whose origins are never fully explained. These absences are not accidents. They are scars left by deliberate forgetting, shaped by fear, admiration, and the desire to turn violence into legend. As modern scholars peel back these layers, a darker picture emerges, not of chaos, but of order built on silence, where what was hidden mattered as much as what was recorded. And as these truths resurface, they force a final unsettling realization. If history worked so hard to look away from the private machinery of empire, what other realities have been buried beneath praise waiting to be uncovered when the myth finally cracks? The haunting legacy, when the Mongol Empire dissolved into rival khanates and its armies no longer shook the ground beneath. Europe and Asia, the systems Genghis Khan created did not disappear with it, because ideas once proven effective tend to outlive the hands that forged them. The strategy of ruling through bloodlines, enforced law, and controlled reproduction left marks that extended far beyond the 13th century, shaping populations, politics, and memory in ways that are still being uncovered today. Genetic studies now suggest that millions of people across vast regions share common ancestry linked to the Mongol ruling elite, a biological echo of policies that turned conquest into inheritance and made the body itself a record of empire. Yet numbers alone cannot capture the human cost of this legacy, because behind every statistic lies a life redirected, a culture weakened, and a choice made under fear rather than freedom. The empire's success forced later rulers to confront an uncomfortable lesson: that power could be stabilized not only through armies and borders, but through control of family lineage and intimacy, a lesson repeated in different forms across history. What makes the Mongol case especially haunting is not only its scale, but its clarity, because few empires pursued these methods so openly or so systematically, leaving behind patterns that scholars can still trace centuries later. Modern admiration for efficiency and order often blurs the line between governance and domination, making it tempting to praise results while ignoring the methods that achieve them. Genghis Khan's story sits at that dangerous intersection, where brilliance and brutality cannot be separated without distortion. His laws brought unity, his strategies built an empire, but they did so by reducing human lives to resources, measured by usefulness rather than dignity. The women who became mothers of conquerors, the children who grew up without knowing the erased names of their ancestors, and the cultures absorbed into silence, all form part of a legacy that refuses to stay buried. History's attempt to smooth these truths into legend has begun to fail, not because the past has changed, but because modern eyes are less willing to accept greatness without cost. As archives are re-examined and old assumptions questioned, the Mongol Empire emerges not as a simple tale of savagery or genius, but as a warning about what happens when power is allowed to define humanity on its own terms. The haunting truth is that these practices were not born from madness or impulse, but from logic, from a cold understanding of how control could be made permanent, and that is what makes them so unsettling. They force us to ask whether progress built on erasure can ever be separated from its violence, or whether the shadows of such systems inevitably stretch into the present. And as we confront the legacy left behind by Genghis Khan, the final question lingers uncomfortably in the dark. If an empire could reshape the world by mastering blood law and silence, how many modern systems are still standing on foundations we refuse to examine closely?